Hi, this is Af Malhotra. Welcome back to Straight Talk with Af. My guest today is a wonderful author, a thinker, a doer, and he has written two very important books. One in 2013 on a topic back in my days at Gartner when I was at the research company. We were talking tons about predictive analytics, and this gentleman wrote a book on it. And the subheading of the book I actually like, if I can remember it. So, predictive analytics, the power to predict who will click, buy, lie, or even die. And that did extremely well. And then another book was written in 2024 called The AI Playbook, which is what we're going to discuss today. I have the amazing Eric Siegel with me. Eric, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Af. Thanks for having me.
Real pleasure. The pleasure's all mine. We're going to go right into it because AI is a hot potato right now. And I'm clear in my mind that you are definitely on the side of the predictive AI and the machine learning aspects of AI, which allows people to extrapolate and use different data sets and figure out why something may happen, like a pattern or a correlation or a causation. And actually, in the world of business, that's been pretty popular, I have to say, and many have deployed that well. There is also another side of AI that's been born recently, sure, and you have a view on it, which is the generative AI side, which is euphoric and people are excited and going onto GPT and typing things and writing essays, writing job applications. Some have been disappointed about the fact that, well, they put up some code, not realizing that it's going to be publicly available. In fact, I've heard companies do that. One particular CIO of a company who'll remain nameless that I know of said to me, Af, it's been brilliant, this GPT thing. We're like debugging at such a fast rate. I'm like, sorry, what? Yeah, my team's just like using GPT to debug. We've never done it before. No consultant's done it at this pace. And I said, do you realize that you're actually letting the entire world know? And as basic as that may be and sound, there are people who don't realize the implications of GPT type environments and they tell it a lot and then give it a lot, as you probably know. So uh, I'd like to pass the baton to you. We will talk about the AI playbook, of course, momentarily. First, as we always do, I'm eager to understand who is Eric and how did you manage to get here? I know you wrote a book a decade ago and you wrote another book. You're an educationalist and an academic. Tell us a little bit about your background and your life as to why AI mattered so much to you and you decided to write a couple of books on it.
Okay, Af, I'm going to go way back, but only because I'm going to connect it directly to what's relevant today. In the late 70s, when I was 10, I started programming and I got really interested in the concept of AI. I had a family, distant relative who was a philosophy professor and a computer enthusiast. And we were pen pals around. What would it mean for a computer to be intelligent? And he covered the Turing test and a Chinese room experiment and all that stuff. So I got fascinated in it. And that took me on my career trajectory. Now I eschew the concept of AI. I think that the concept of AI is great for fiction, philosophy, maybe for anthropology. It's like, hey, humans are kind of trying to recreate themselves. But for engineering, for technology, where you're trying to build something, you can't build something if you don't define it well. And intelligence is a word that's, if nothing, if not specifically human, it's wholly subjective. Doesn't define the objective of what you're trying to accomplish. And despite the seemingly human-like capabilities we see from these large language models like ChatGPT, which is unprecedented and absolutely knocks my socks off. I never thought I'd see something like this. I do not believe we're uh, actually concretely making steady progress towards general human level capabilities. I think that, though, is the narrative underlying most of the coverage of AI these days, and that it's misleading. Now, the idea of learning rather than intelligence, the idea of a computer learning from examples, yes, it's a human concept, but it can be a bit more narrowly defined in a very concrete way, and the computer can do it. And that's what machine learning is, learning from data to predict.
Right.
And that is very, very, uh, very valuable and very actionable, concrete ways. Predict who's going to, as you said in the title of my first book, who's going to click, buy, lie, or die, commit an act of fraud, turn out to be a bad creditor, be a good location to drill for oil, be a satellite that might run out of battery that you should inspect, a wheel of a train that you should inspect, et cetera, et cetera. Any and all organizational units on that level of detail, any behavior outcome that could be valuable for improving all the main large scale operations. Take that same concept of learning to predict and apply it on a per word, essentially, on a per word level of detail. What should the next word be? I've written these 2.5 paragraphs up to half a sentence. What should the next word be? Predict that. Okay, write that word. Now do it again. Iteratively doing that. Same core type of technology, learning from data to predict, now being applied on that per word level. That's large language models, right? That's one form of generative AI where it's generating writing. Unbelievable, uncanny human-like aura. Some emergent capabilities where it seems to reason well in some cases, some of the time, and other cases not. It's not really reliable. That's amazing, and has definitely only multiplied what I see as a fictional narrative, which is that we're headed toward general human level capabilities. And I feel that that narrative underlies most of the rhetoric on the international stage around AI, which is bad because hype is bad for a reason. We eschew hype for a reason. The distance between reality and expectations, what's plausible versus sort of what's believed, means disillusionment. It's a setup for a costly downfall, what might amount even to another AI winter, we call it, which is no good for anybody because in those scenarios, the baby gets thrown out with the bathwater, right? So where there is real value, and indeed, predictive is not the only thing that's valuable. Generative, for generating new content items like writing and images, certainly very valuable, just probably not nearly as valuable as the general hype is telling us.
Yeah, bang
So
on.
that's
It's a
my
really
big
nice way of
monologue
describing
on
it.
this is my sort of overall. I'm trying to as succinctly as possible say what my overall kind of take on what's going on with AI right now is.
Yeah. Tell us about your background a little bit. So, which part of the world are you in? And if I can ask and probe a little bit more as to
Yeah.
how, our audience is always interested in the story behind the book and the person behind the book.
Sure.
And how do they get to the point at which they started to write a book and get so passionate about such a topic? Tell us a little bit, if I may push you more to just talk about your background.
Well, I like reality. I like concrete value, and that's what my new book is about. Because there's a lot of theatrics around sort of the anthropomorphizing of machines, and there's also theatrics of just in enterprise machine learning projects. Hey, we're using the best technology, but are they actually capturing value with it? Is it actually getting deployed and changing operations so that the business runs more effectively and it actually deliver some bottom line improvement? So I'm in the San Francisco area. I lived in New York City for a really long time where I did both graduate school and then I was on the faculty at Columbia University, all in the computer science department. And I was teaching the AI and machine learning graduate level courses there. I've been an independent consultant now for just about 20 years. No, excuse me, just about 21 years. So, and I've been in the field of machine learning for about 33 years. Um, and if my first book is sort of how does machine learning work in these predictive applications, it's called predictive analytics or predictive AI if you want to differentiate it from generative AI. So the first book's really about what's the value proposition, how does it work under the hood. My new book, the AI Playbook, is how to capitalize on it. So the subtitle of that book is Mastering the Rare Art of Machine Learning Deployment. Actually getting it, not just developing it, but deploying it, integrating it, moving it into production, actually making a change to business by way essentially of the predictions that it delivers on a per individual basis, right? As I mentioned earlier. So it turns out that most new machine learning projects, even if they're relatively well conceived and have a concrete value proposition, fail to reach deployment. So the project stalls before actually operationalizing. That track record, which is dismal, really stands to be improved. And it basically comes down to a disconnect between biz and tech. And both sides are kind of buying into need to reframe. Both sides, both biz and tech, both the data scientists and their client, the stakeholder, the person in charge of the operations meant to be improved with the predictions of a machine learning model. Both sides are conceiving it as a technology project. We're kind of leading with the technology. We fetishize this core rocket science, which is so cool and amazing. It's like being more excited about the rocket science than the launch of the rocket. No, the project needs to be reframed as a business operations improvement project.
Mm.
Yeah, that sounds much more boring,
Yeah.
right? Selling change and change management is like trying to sell a root canal. It's not nearly as sexy as awesome technology that learns from data, learns from experience, right? That has highfalutin names like machine learning, predictive analytics, and not to mention AI, the most highfalutin term that we could actually ever think of when it comes to technology, because it's
Mm.
about anthropomorphizing a machine. So in this system, in this syndrome that's so routinely repeated, um, we're we're losing track of the value, of the point, of the operationalization, um, and we're focused and fixated so much on, like, I can sleep soundly tonight because we're using the best technology, which may be true, but the technology is not intrinsically valuable only if you act on its outputs, only if you integrate it in that way. So what we need is a new union between biz and tech, which includes that business side stakeholders need to get involved in some of the gritty detail, uh, but only semi-technical understanding,
Mm.
super accessible, much more interesting, applicable, and valuable in general purpose enterprise projects than high school algebra. So there's no reason we shouldn't be getting into it. It comes down to what's predicted, how well, and what's done about it. So
Mm.
what's predicted is, well, if the customer is going to buy, then spend the money to contact them, include them on a marketing campaign. Um, how well? Well, that's how good is the model? How well does it predict, and how much value do you stand to capture by actually changing operations with those predictions? So again, what's predicted, how well, and what's done about it, which is such a widely applicable thing. That's why machine learning is considered and called, for example, by Harvard Business Review, the most important general purpose technology of the century, is that it's just so widely applicable. So, but it only is you only benefit from that if it's applied, right? If it's not only do the number crunching, but actually launch it.
Yeah. I remember back in the day, the role, let's talk about business and IT or business and technology, because a lot of your book, and I've been reading parts of it, is, I would imagine, directed towards people who are executives and companies trying to figure out how they can do a better job of machine learning and predictive analytics, right? And it's been debated and discussed for a long time. There have been so many books on predictive analytics, so much thinking, so much debate, so much discussion. And yet, you are right, many of these projects actually don't see the light of day. They collapse. Back in the day, we used to talk about a 70 or 80% project, a slip or failure rate on standard IT projects. And then I
Mhm.
guess this gets even more complex because of the change management
So,
and the need to go to different business units to say, give me data and so on. Go ahead,
yeah,
sorry.
yeah. I mean, so it does it. We understand that that's a general trend across technology projects, and IT in particular. The thing about these projects, which have shown to have something in that ballpark, and I've been involved in industry research I describe in the book and in some articles, where data scientists are like, hey, we just don't actually get to deployment. The what has to happen is, um, sorry, I lost my train of thought. So
You were talking about the business and IT and the failure of projects, and this is a bit
yeah.
different.
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah. So essentially, it's even worse because the challenge is bigger because we're talking about acting on probabilities, right? So for business stakeholders, people in charge who aren't not necessarily data scientists and aren't necessarily don't have that intensity of a technical background, aren't are probability has a really bad reputation, right? Of being seeming arcane or and boring, right, or even intimidating. Whereas it's actually not. Um, a probability is a number between 0 and 100 of how likely is this thing to happen. And why do we need that? Because we don't have a magic crystal ball. We don't have high confidence in general about whether somebody's going to click, buy, lie, or die. But what we do have are predictions that are better than guessing, which comes down to a probability. You're going to put it, you can't say it's 100% or 0%. You have to put it on that scale. And
Yeah.
doing so is totally valuable for then using that to inform the way you're running all these decisions about who to contact, mail, approve, medicate, incarcerate, set up on a date, whatever it is, right? So all these types of projects being run by probabilities, but the probability itself is just a number between 0 and 100, doesn't necessarily involve heavy math. So there's an intimidation factor that really is a much thinner membrane to break through and be like, oh, wait, actually, this isn't that hard to understand, the semi-technical understanding, what's predicted, how well, and what's done about it.
Yeah, yeah. Do you want to take a little bit of time just to help some of our listeners understand the difference or distinction between predictive AI and generative AI? I think you did that at the beginning when you were talking about text and how Gen AI predicts texts. But
So, I mean,
you
they're
talk
built
about
on the
machine
same.
learning. Yeah,
Yeah, they're both built with machine learning, learning from
yeah,
data to predict.
yeah,
It's just that generative AI is using much more sophisticated and expensive and bigger and more impressive, amazing
yeah.
models, that is, machine learning methods, algorithms, and on much larger data typically. Um, and as a result, it's learning what word to predict next. Or if it's rendering an image, it's predicting, how do I change this pixel? And it does this for each pixel during the next iteration as I, the computer, am generating this image, right? So, and similar stuff with generating music and sound and video, whatever it is, it's generating a new content item. These things are built on the same core technology or sort of category of technology, machine learning, or you call it predictive modeling.
Mm. Yeah,
But they're so different. They're just completely different ways of using it with different results. Generative AI is much, much, much easier to use, right? Anybody can use it. You can just go play with ChatGPT, just start typing, right? By definition, because they operate with human languages like English,
mm,
right? And they will generate new content items. That's a very different thing than predicting for each individual customer or other organizational unit to drive an enterprise operation. So it's like comparing water parks and ski resorts, right? They shouldn't compete, they shouldn't cannibalize one another, but they do, right? And generative sucks the oxygen out of the air because it's shiny new object and it glitters like nothing I've ever seen. If nothing else, it's the best demo for sure. I mean, it's
that's right.
amazing. Um, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's valuable. And in fact, if generative AI is much easier to use, I would assert it's much harder to use well in the sense of delivering concrete, proven, measured enterprise value. And that's where we have the great opportunities. Predictive AI is the type of AI, is the technology you turn to for improving your largest scale existing operations.
Yeah. Many would have thought, given the maturity curve on predictive analytics and the use of machine learning, because it's a term that has been discussed for many years, that global corporations and organizations are doing a pretty good job of it generally, right? Tell us a little bit about where you see the holes or where you feel a bit concerned that, well, actually, it's not being done well. And then, of course, some good stories of success where you think, wow, they've absolutely knocked the ball out of the park.
And you said predictive with respect to predictive, is that right?
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let me answer in the opposite order. Let me tell you the good stuff first, right?
Sure.
There's a
Sure.
million examples. I mean, I've been running this conference series, Machine Learning Week, formerly Predictive Analytics World, since 2009, and the bread and butter of that are proven case studies of deployment and success. My first book, the updated edition, is actually 2016, a little bit later. Predictive Analytics has a center color table, several pages with 183 mini case studies of success. The new book focuses on success stories from UPS, FICO, and a couple .coms that were my own clients. Well,
Right.
okay, one .com. The other .com story is one of the failure examples in my new book. Anyway, so let me just give you a brief overview of the UPS example. This is an astounding thing where they actually successfully got change to existing longstanding operations. This is a company that's now more than 100 years old.
Right.
Um, it's hard. Change is hard. The number crunching takes some ingenuity, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to actually get it deployed. That's where things actually usually go wrong. So there's a lot
Mm.
of drama. It's like a soap opera when you read about this. And I got the story from the horse's mouth, Jack Levis, who was had a very boring title at UPS, Senior Director of Process Management. But boring is exciting, right? Stodgy is the new sexy, because this is where you get value when you actually get processes to change and thereby improve. So UPS improves their delivery of packages by predicting deliveries. So at each of, let's say, 1,000 shipping centers across the United States, what they have to do for this sort of last mile or last several miles, to be more literal, of delivery in the trucks from the shipping center to their end destinations is overnight or even starting the late afternoon of the previous day. They have to both plan and then load the way all these packages are going to be allocated to the trucks so that each truck has a relatively optimal route and that they're going to overall save as much time and miles as possible during the on-time departure of the trucks tomorrow morning. But the dilemma they have is when they have to start that process for those on-time departures, they have incomplete information. They don't know all the packages that are going to still be coming into the shipping center overnight that night. Some they don't even know whether they exist yet. The system is complex. So what they do is they augment the known packages that they physically have in hand with a set of tentatively presumed predicted deliveries destinations for tomorrow. And next week, et cetera, for other operationals. But in particular, for what are we going to do tonight in terms of planning and loading these trucks? By doing that, they radically improve the overall efficiency of this very complex optimization problem of how you allocate them to trucks so that the trucks driving tomorrow is relatively optimal. And that system was called package flow, in combination with another system that is a time newly introduced prescribed driving directions, like GPS. That is to say, look, a truck might be packed pretty well. It has a relatively optimal potential route that could be driven. That doesn't mean it's going to actually follow an optimal route unless you actually tell the driver exactly where to drive.
Yeah.
And so in combination, the UPS now enjoys a savings of 185 million miles of driving a year, 8 million gallons of fuel, and 185,000 metric tons of emissions.
Wow. It's insane. Did they do that in-house or got someone to do it for them? Do you know?
Oh, it's totally in-house. And so that story kind of bookends the book, both the intro and then one of the last chapters go through different chapters of that story where there's drama. He had to convince executives above him and then ultimately the staff workers. It's like full stack organizational buy-in. The staff who are on the loading dock need to stop overriding prescribed allocation of packages, at least for the most part. And that change to their behavior took more of a fall through on the swing, the change management process. So they did a relatively good job of really planning this thing for change from the get-go of the project. And that's relatively rare. But not quite good enough. So there were some trials and tribulations. There's a soap opera drama, right? Ups and downs. And then they circle back, follow through, and ultimately succeed.
Wow.
So, it's like a big triumphant change management process and with amazing results. But most predictive analytics projects don't need that nearly of a complex thing of like, okay, we're going to predict packages and those predictions are going to go into an already complex optimization system of allocating packages. In general, typical projects have a much more simple link between what's predicted and then what's done about it. So like, if this customer is going to buy, contact them, market to them. Is this customer going to cancel, try to retain them, right? Is this transaction likely to be fraud? Then investigate it or block it. Oftentimes, it's a very simple, straightforward relationship between the two.
And I
But
guess
even
you have
in that
to.
case,
Sorry,
yeah,
I was
even
going
in
to say.
that case, it
Yeah.
doesn't get deployed. So yeah.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, going back to the simple cases. So I guess that's creating a rules engine or a set of triggers that you're looking for that client. For example, a client's going to buy. Are you seeing organizations, given that you wrote your first book back in 2013 and then an update 2016, you would imagine that you're seeing mass deployment of predictive analytics based technologies because everyone believes that they want a better handle on their business. So surely it's happening like in sales or supply chain and marketing much more than you've ever seen before. It's a positive thing, right?
Oh yeah, it's definitely spreading more and more. I mean, there's just so many different ways that it applies. So I've been hearing a lot more, for example, in my recent meetings, which is not a representative sample. This is not from industry research, just in my own particular goings-ons, about, hey, look, we're trying to deliver this sensitive package that has to be temperature controlled. It's in limbo. Now the
Yeah.
organization has to make a choice. Do we send people out on the field to investigate and make sure that package is not going to get stuck for too long, and that costs something? Or are we going to predict that it's probably fine and it'll get back on track, which would also cost something if you're wrong. It'll probably cost even more depending on the contents of the package. Um, Reliability modeling. Is this component of a hydropower plant or a tugboat going to break down, and should we stop, if we shut the whole system down to investigate it, or should we wait for it to break, which could be even worse? So all of these decisions are only, I mean, the holy grail for improving these decisions is prediction. And yes, more and more, all of these types of operations are definitely being improved and informed by the predictions, by the probabilities output by a machine learning model. So even if a majority of these projects unfortunately fail, and I think that a lot of that is avoidable, a small portion, or whatever it is, 15 to 20% of many projects is still many successes.
Yeah, yeah. So you talk a lot about the corporate stories, and they're powerful, of course, and there's some failures that we'll get to in a second. What about small companies and SMEs or startups? Let's just talk about SMEs who are sort of non-traditional, or traditional businesses, should I say, non-IT businesses. Are you seeing, them pick this up? Many of them don't even have IT managers or IT leaders or CIOs because they're way too small. What do they do? What are you seeing? I mean, what sort of software tools are out there where you could quickly deploy this in your operational landscape or your function?
Unfortunately, there's no holy grail with regard to software solutions, although the vendors will certainly imply otherwise, because these are consulting gigs,
Right.
not technology installs. It's a business operations improvement project, which is very specialized for the whatever the particular line of business and operations and processes you're trying to improve, and the particular available data from which you need to learn that needs to be pulled together and put into a sort of clean, simple format for the purposes of machine learning software. So it doesn't matter which solution you're using as far as actually training the model from data, the actual learning part of machine learning. It's still a specialized project. And definitely smaller businesses are often have trouble, but not, there's plenty of successes, but often have trouble kind of getting enough bandwidth and resources to get that whole process together. They're probably more likely to be using external resources and consultancies, services. But the the value proposition doesn't depend on the size of the organization. It depends on the size of the operation it's meant to be improved. So if you're like this really small mom and pop and you send once a year a holiday catalog selling candy, uh, direct mail, and it's sent to 1 million prospects, right? Then you've got data from which to learn. You've got a whole bunch of cases where people either did or didn't respond to that
Hmm.
outgoing
Hmm.
marketing, and you can use that to potentially target your marketing in future iterations, future campaigns. So it's the size, the scale of the operation, which generally corresponds with the scale of the data, right? I mean, that's sort of the nice thing about this, is that you tend to have the right amount of data for the processes that matter the most. The ones that matter the most are the largest scale. That means you've been, as a side effect of conducting business as usual. And that's what big data is in general. It's sort of a side effect. It's the residue of conducting business. So you've accumulated enough positive and negative examples from which to learn, sort of organically, to
Right.
learn to improve exactly the largest scale operation. If it's large scale, you've got the data probably.
Where do you see the sort of exciting deployments? So if you think about what you've picked up and covered so far in your books, and then the possibilities, like the art of the possible around predictive analytics, predictive AI. What are the possibilities? What can we say to excite people, to give them some
Yeah,
imagination?
I'm glad you asked that question about excitement, because when you're doing the number crunching, it just can very quickly become abstract, and it's just this like, how well can we get to predict, and what's it going to do for the factors? But let's take a step back and talk about what the stakes are with large scale operations. As I mentioned with UPS, 185,000 metric tons of emissions a year, right? It saves them $350 million a year. Um, I'm talking to a colleague who's working on a predictive model to try to detect problems in medical devices. So they stick a really tiny camera in there, and it takes lots of pictures. And then the pictures, a predictive model, machine learning,
Mm.
looks at the pictures and puts the odds on whether what it's seeing is some kind of a defect.
Right.
Now, if you decide to, you have to open up this little medical device and inspect it for a potential defect, that can be very expensive. It can sort of end up costing that entire device,
Yeah.
itself as it rolls off the assembly line or what have you. Um, and if you don't, and it was a false negative, and it turns out it actually did have a defect, then you're quite potentially killing a patient, exposing them to sepsis or what have you. So the stakes are unbelievable. And this is one of the last remaining, in a sense, it's the last remaining major consequential method of differentiation for improving large scale operations. The
Mm.
world streamlines itself. That's what businesses are. They're a way of turning operations into some kind of a rote process. Business is a numbers game. There's always going to be errors. Most direct marketing is junk mail and it goes into recycling bin. So much email is spam. You're never going to get it right 100% of the time. We don't have magic crystal balls. The thing that the recourse is prediction. Prediction is the holy grail for improving these large scale operations. And the operations, by definition, are the things that matter most. They are the most consequential. They're large scale. So all these projects really matter.
Mm, mm. I think what I find very, very exciting about the state of AI today in general, both Gen and classic or predictive AI, is that if you think of the global business population right now versus 10 years ago, right? And I remember from my corporate days before I transitioned into a startup, I was with a corporation and working with CIOs constantly. And I remember the pain points were the business don't get it, they don't understand IT, the business, technology, the
Mhm.
business, your projects
Mhm.
fail, you take too long, and so on. And while some of that still continues, the tools and the technology that leaders have at their disposal now are just unbelievable, right? I mean, I remember a time as a sales guy years and years ago, without incriminating any company, but it is what it is. I used to use Siebel, and Siebel back then was really cool, but it
Mhm.
was a friggin' clunky product. And then we started to use SFA. Salesforce came about, which was on the cloud, and it was way faster. And you
Mhm.
uploaded stuff, and the analytics came out, and salespeople were like, "Wow, this is insane! Like we've been asking for this like throughout our
Mhm.
career." And that took years to get to. Now we're seeing these massive flips happening at an alarming rate. Like Moore's law has gone like thrown in the dustbin with what's going on with Gen AI. It's moving at such a fast pace. How do you feel about businesses moving forward, like large corporations and the people in these large corporations, and their level of readiness around what you're describing? Because you've been talking about it for a long time, like 30 years in ML. There's got to be a time at which you were frustrated, thinking, "Bloody hell, this is a nightmare." Like I'm saying the same thing until I go blue. Do you feel a little bit better about it now? Like you can come up and breathe again and feel like, God, something is going to happen, or are you still sort of semi in that state? How do you feel about it? Because you've been a professor
Well,
too.
I have mixed feelings. I mean, the unbelievable hype around AI is a mixed blessing at best.
Yeah.
If I personally have frustration, I'll just admit it now. It's about the AI hype and the intrinsic anthropomorphization narrative that I believe is false. But as far as just sort of people getting it and what I've put in the new book, what's predicted, how well, what's done about it. That semi-technical understanding. I don't need to know how the car engine works, but I need to be an expert in driving, momentum,
Right.
friction, the rules of the road, the way other mutual expectations of drivers, how the car operates. Um, Same thing is true. You need some kind of semi-technical expertise to drive a machine learning project successfully through to a value-driven deployment. Um, Now, I actually don't really feel that frustrated about the world at large not quite getting it yet. It's kind of job security, you know what I mean? Like that, like that's what I'm doing is I'm trying to get the word out there. Now, as far as the technology improving, unfortunately, that in and of itself is not a solution to the issue.
Yeah.
Because again, these are consulting gigs. This is an enterprise deployment. It's a paradigm, it's a way of doing things. It's a way of framing operations and looking at what does it mean to use the best of data-driven decisioning, which is to say, the right number crunching, which is uh, calculate probabilities. That's what it comes down to. I mean, we hate to say it. That's why we call it predictive AI or predictive analytics or machine learning. We don't call it applied probability. Because if we called it applied probability, people would fall asleep before we got to the prob syllable of the phrase. We'd say applied prob, and then they'd already be falling asleep, right? But that's actually what it is, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we're just trying
Yeah.
to put odds on things because that's what helps the
Yeah.
most critical operations. Um, whereas generative doesn't really have, for many of its potential uses, doesn't face the same deployment challenge, right? If I'm a fiction writer and I want to like improve these 3 paragraphs, I'll just open ChatGPT. It's just there for me and I just use it. And then if it's valuable, if I like what it wrote, great, right? There's no barrier there.
Yeah.
Um, whereas I think both the opportunities and barriers are higher if we want to use technology to improve large scale operations. But
Yeah.
that's what I'm a proponent of, right? I mean, that's what I've been doing as a consultant for 21 years.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about climate and net zero and whether that movement and regulation around ESG, for example, has had a positive effect or a negative effect on the use of technologies that you describe and compute. How's that going? What are you sensing is happening there? Because sometimes it's hard to understand.
You know, I'm not an expert. I'm sort of just a lay person when it comes to understanding the ramifications of large language models and other generative AI models that we know are consuming as much energy as small cities and great amounts of fresh water and those kinds of things. Um, it's certainly a concern, and I certainly think that um, what I've been complaining about here, which is that the world is so enamored with this thing because of a fictional narrative of it approaching artificial general intelligence, like basically artificial humans, something that can
Mhm.
do anything a
Mhm.
person can do, general human level capabilities, whatever you want to call it. I believe that that's a false narrative. It's an intoxicating one, and it elicits fear of losing jobs, for which I think the fear is overblown, um, and fear of an apocalypse if the thing actually becomes, fully capable like a person, and then can conduct AI research itself, and then the Skynet's the limit, right? It just
Mhm. Mhm.
self-improves. And the uh, both the intoxication of fear kind of flip sides of the same coin. The negative stuff is crita hype. I didn't coin that term. Um, and I think that it definitely adds to the ability we have as a species to overlook the environmental impact of pumping up these models. I mean, everyone wants it. It's treated as a necessity, as if it's the best thing since the wheel and sliced bread. Um, in as if it's intrinsically valuable, as if it's a foregone conclusion that it'll only keep improving along some fictional dimension that stands between it and humans,
Right.
like,
Right.
and then overpass it. But intelligence doesn't exist that way. Intelligence isn't even a thing that can be
Mhm.
defined.
Mhm.
It's just something about the way we understand what we're capable of. And what we're capable of as humans is so multifaceted and amazing. Um, so as a nerd, I think that large language models um, are by far the most amazing thing I've ever seen at all, ever,
Mhm.
other than life, right?
Right. Right.
Let's not forget
Right.
how amazing
Life
life,
and LLMs. Okay.
right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let's not, but the thing is, it's easy to forget how amazing life is and humans
Yeah.
are, right? That's
Yeah.
that's just, I mean, that's what you spend your whole life fighting against, right? Is to stop taking life for granted. Like it's
Yeah.
almost impossible. Um, uh, but if you were an alien, you came down and saw it for the first time, you might be like, "Whoa, look at the way these things have. Well, that's crazy. Look at the things and the tentacles and right." And you and I both have young kids, so then they look at these biology or books or what have you, and they're just fascinated, right?
Mm.
So, but by the time we're decision makers, that fascination's gone.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm with you. Another important topic is talent, right? And I want to sort of give this a slight different spin as opposed to just talking about talent and STEM and so on. I want to bring in the bit that's really important for me in my journey, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion globally. And the concept for me is very much just about embracing people of difference, people with different views, ideas, who look different, who think different, who speak different languages, and they have a multi-level, multi-lens perspective on the issue at hand, the problem at hand, or the opportunity at hand. And creating a group of different people, if we can all get along, ends up being a very good thing because we all bring our unique perspectives to the table. Of course, we've got to fix that issue related to the human condition, where we're territorial and there's ego and all of the other factors that come in, bias and prejudice and discrimination, all the other factors. But I love difference. I embrace difference. I'm an entrepreneur and I'm an innovator. So innovators love difference and they like experimenting with different things, and they realize things break in that process. We're actually quite used to failure, and then one day there will be success. But we're a outlier species, right? The majority of the normal distribution hasn't quite figured out the DEI thing. It's still a journey that we're on. I wanted to link DEI with AI talent of the future in the Western world. So let's just talk about the West, like the States, Europe, UK, and so on. And one of the problems we see is, at least in the UK, I'm sure you have some glimpses of that in the US, which is the lack of AI data science related talent. Like we're not investing enough in creating the next generation of talent. More importantly, we're not seeing many diverse people in that makeup, not just ethnic and gender, but all of the other areas, people with physical disabilities, people who have neurodiversity, people, much younger people much older. Why shouldn't someone who's much older come into AI and retrain themselves now outside of being in a job? All of these other factors. What is your general take and view on the next 5, 7, 10 years? And what if I gave you a magic wand? What would you do if I gave you the responsibility to address the talent gap in AI holistically? What would you do? Just your random thoughts.
No, I mean, I completely agree that improving in diversity of the teams, the personnel behind, I mean, all technologies, including generative AI and predictive AI, is a necessary factor for navigating all the different ethical pitfalls around their deployment. And I'd like to believe that we're moving in the right direction, that the diversity is improving. I don't really know how to measure that change. I can't say I have the data. I will say at the same time, let me give you my thoughts on where I think there's some of the most critical ethical risks with
Right.
the predictive deployments, as the kind of thing that needs to be dealt with, and that would only be dealt with better by a more diverse team, which is the ability to potentially be discriminatory or biased. And those things can be defined in pretty particular ways. So when you deploy a model to improve all these different kinds of large scale operations, right, you're not just streamlining business and improving number crunching, you're governing, because these are very consequential decisions that are being driven by
Right.
predictions. Who gets housing, how long someone stays in prison. Judges and paroles make decision about early release and sentencing decisions based on predicted probability of being rearrested and convicted again. Whether you're granted an application for a credit card, or any
Right.
other kind of loan.
Right. Right.
These are very consequential decisions, and the number crunching, even if sort of done with a neutral stance, it turns out, right, it promulgates existing injustices. So here's the definition of what's called machine bias. And there's a very famous ProPublica article named Machine Bias that really originated this this inquiry, is that if it's making consequential decisions that are wrong, like somebody is unjustly or unnecessarily kept in prison longer, or denied access to a credit card or something like that. If it makes sort of the wrong choice in that way, a costly error that's costly to the individual citizen, that's bad. Now, again, we can't solve that problem with machines. Humans make error. Nobody has a magic crystal ball. Humans don't have clairvoyance, and we can't expect computers to either. So that if we're giving machines the ability to inform, be this deciding factor on, or even in some cases directly automate these decisions, then we're letting the machine make unfair decisions. Where social justice comes in is when the prevalence of these costly errors is higher among a protected group, like a minority group. So that particular ProPublica article I described, called Machine Bias, is about the sentencing decisions based on predicting whether somebody will be rearrested and convicted. I can't remember the word for that right now. But it turned out that black male convicts were twice as likely to face a false positive as white male convicts. A huge difference in false positive rates systematically, right? And these are a reflection. It comes as a reflection of the unjust world, the state of those subpopulations that obviously result from historical injustices.
Yeah.
So look, this is sort of horrifying, but at the same time, it presents an unprecedented opportunity, which is that it both puts on the table and under a spotlight the quantification of that injustice. And because we're deploying it, we're acting on these predictions. That deployment infrastructure provides a platform on which to actually enact intentional improvements to justice, adjusting scores or doing number crunching so that you adjust away from that type of unjust, unequal false positive rate is what it basically comes down to. So that's biased. Discriminatory would be where the model is allowed to actually consider the protected class itself. So it could literally say, oh, okay, you're this race, therefore we're going to penalize your job application by 7 points. That could literally happen if you allowed it direct access. So if in that sense, machine learning needs to be, quote, colorblind, and it usually is by legal requirement, but not always. And there's especially exceptions. I've written articles on these and give a bunch of examples, op-eds published in the San Francisco Chronicle, the Scientific American blog, and a whole bunch. I've published like 15, plus I made some videos that help explain it all. And it's all available at civilrightsdata.com. That's civilrightsdata.com is a link that'll list all my op-eds.
Yeah. We'll just make a note of that. Civilrightsdata.com. That's publicly available then, right?
Oh, yeah.
So we've touched on a series of very important issues. We're coming to the end of the show. You're not just an author and a thinker, you're also a doer in the sense that you've got a startup. Tell us about your startup.
Yes, Gooder AI. And we've been doing this for almost a year. We're very early stage. We've got a product that's just going to trials, and this is to evaluate models. So here's how it works. And this is sort of the ultimate place where there's a disconnect between tech and business. The data scientist will typically make a predictive model and then evaluate how good it is, establish its quantitative measure its quantitative performance in terms of these very technical, arcane metrics like precision recall, and perhaps the favorite is called area under the curve. Rather than simply also measuring its potential business value in very straightforward KPIs or metrics like profit or savings. And essentially that's not done. So the stakeholder, the person who's in charge of the operations and would be the decision maker who needs to authorize the deployment, is like, well, how good is this model? How much is it going to improve the business performance if we start acting on these probabilities? And generally, the data scientist is at a loss. They're not trained to do it. Their tools don't allow it. So that's the missing ingredient. It's a new piece of software once the model's been trained, but before you deploy it or before you redeploy it or continue to manage it or refresh it and do a champion challenger, you got to make a best practice estimation of how good it is in terms of business metrics. And that's what our solution does at Gooder AI. So if anyone's listening and you've got a predictive model or you're working on predictive models that are meant to or actively being deployed, we're early stage, but a really super fast and easy if you're interested in a early access trial on your model to get that visibility and get a new type of insight about the potential value of the model.
Wow, I love it. So in other words, you're making it super easy to close the gap that you described, but also the speed at which someone can sort of extrapolate and figure out the potential benefits of their base data through the predictive model that you've created. You've created a software, I presume, that where you plug in some numbers or you upload numbers, something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, the key
Yeah,
word that you said in there is what's the potential benefit, right?
yeah,
So right now it's sort of like you do the technical metrics are just these pure predictive performance
right,
measures. They're
right.
in a vacuum, just how well does how much better than some baseline like random guessing? What's the
Yeah,
relative performance of the model? And yeah,
yeah,
it turns out you see these metrics and you're like, oh, it definitely predicts a lot better than guessing, which
yeah,
means it's potentially valuable. So if I'm going to offer an expensive discount of 30% off next month to customers at risk of defection, of canceling, right? And if somebody, data scientist gives me a model, it's like, shows me numbers that say this is
yeah.
much better than guessing. It just seems clear, hey, it would really be a good idea to target our retention investment to those that are much more likely than average to cancel. But what about actually also making a concrete estimation of just how much value you'll get by doing that? Where should you draw the line? Should you
Right,
use this
right.
model to target the top 5% most likely to defect, the top 7%? All these decisions should be made in business terms, not technical terms. In
Got
terms
it.
of absolute business value, very straightforward. The lingua franca of business is the metrics that any and all stakeholders can understand, like profit and savings, top line revenue, bottom line, whatever it is. So what's the potential benefit? We got to actually measure it. If you're not measuring the business value, you're not pursuing business value.
This is really, really cool. I can think about many use cases for this if it's what you if it does what you say it does. Of course, I'm sure it
Yeah.
does. In fact, even for startups, not only established businesses, many of us are trying to create models or trying to figure out how predictive models could work in certain scenarios. This could be a
Mhm.
scenario tool that we could also use, right? To
Yeah, it's
strengthen
essentially a
efficacy.
scenario tool is a good way of putting it because
Yeah.
that's the difference between technical measures like in a vacuum, just pure predictive, how well does it predict? But
Yeah.
when you want to go to business value, it has to be in the context of exactly how you're going to use the model,
I
the
love it.
business factors, the deployment plan, the business inputs. So those are the scenarios that you can adjust visually. And because of that, to do this to actually follow this greatly needed as yet after decades omitted step of moving to business metrics and sussing out and stress testing a model in terms of its intended usage does require a very specialized graphical user interface to let you do those what ifs.
Totally. I love it. We're going to pick up on that offline because I think that's going to be super
Okay,
helpful for us in the work that we're doing. I've had
sure.
a wonderful conversation with you, Eric. What a fantastic man you are. And
Thanks,
I love the
man.
work that you've been doing. You continue to invest yourself over 3 decades into machine learning. And luckily, machine learning's now become cool, right? I remember a time when it was like, oh, the geeky stuff. Now
Oh yeah.
everyone wants to know about machine learning and RAG models
It's
and
too
generative AI.
cool. It's too
It's
cool for its own good.
yeah, it's too cool for its own good. That's another problem. Hey, that's another problem. But thank you so much. Any other books planned for the future?
Nope, just focus on the startup for now.
Okay, good. And so
Yeah.
you've come onto my neck of the woods, which is the entrepreneurial startup founder space, and I'm deeply grateful. Have a wonderful journey on your
Thank you.
startup. I'm sure you will absolutely crush it. And do come back at some point to tell us about how what you've been thinking about, writing about, teaching about, you've put into practice with Godo AI and what
Will do.
happened. So over the next year or so, I will absolutely knock on your door again, probably before, just after this call, but certainly to bring you back onto the show. So Eric Siegel, thank you so
Awesome.
much. Really
Yeah,
appreciate it.
my pleasure. Great talking to you, Af.
You too. Before you go, last 4 or 5 seconds, how was the call and the session today and the discussion today? Just some input for us would be amazing.
Sure. Is this part of the podcast or are
This is
we?
part of the podcast. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Awesome. Well, no, are you kidding? Like, I love what you do. I mean, I watched a bunch of episodes preparing for this, and I really appreciate you bringing me on. Um, because you're so multidisciplinary, right? And you're not just focused on business. You're not just focused on technology. You're especially not just focused on AI. It's a very broad thing, right, around psychology. You've got such a wide range of guests, and I think and by doing that, you've set a platform where whatever the expertise and focus of your guest, right, it's a bigger context, right, and so you can sort of broaden the discussion, and in that way, maybe becomes a more enlightening conversation, right, because then you're putting it in a broader context, right, and sort of framing it's more informative because you're putting a better, doing a more complete job of really describing a perspective from a broader view.
Got it. Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for taking time and watching the other episodes. That's extraordinary in itself. So I really appreciate it. Eric Siegel, thank you so much, guys and girls. Appreciate you coming and watching this show. That's me, Af Malhotra, Straight Talk with Af.com. And I will see you at the next episode. All the best. Take care. Have a great night.